Everybody. So today we're going to be talking about synthesis. For upcoming assignments, you'll need to synthesize sources, and you have an essay that involves some synthesis as well. So here is what we do when we are synthesizing. So first of all, it's important to understand what synthesis is. And basically, it involves grouping information together in a way that helps readers understand what several different people have to say about that particular subject. And really importantly, it also includes how those views intersect. So at its most basic, synthesis involves drawing connections between sources. It's not the same as summary, but you should still summarize each source for yourself in preparation for synthesizing that information. Synthesis can have lots of different purposes depending on the type of assignment that you're creating. So that's another thing that's important to be aware of, right? You want to make sure that you read the assignment carefully so that you know kind of why you're synthesizing and what your purpose is. So some basic steps that I'd like you to take when you're synthesizing for our class are listed here. First, read and annotate the sources that you're synthesizing. Second, summarize each source briefly, and as you're summarizing, keep in mind any connections that you see between the sources. Decide which information to include in your own writing based on the purpose of the assignment that you're working towards. And then finally, write that synthesis based on all of this work that you've just done. So, what does annotating for synthesis look like? Remember that annotating involves interacting with the text. This is when you are going to be highlighting key information. You might be writing yourself some notes in the margins about, things that you find interesting or things like that. But remember that when you're annotating for synthesis, you're going to be doing this with a purpose. So you might be looking for evidence to support your own research. You might be looking for a particular kind of information that you need to fill a gap in a paper that you're writing. Or in this case, you might be looking for just those connections with other texts, right? So keep that in mind because there are lots of ways that synthesis sort of works its way into different kinds of assignments. And in this case, we're just sort of testing the waters with synthesis and starting to learn about it. So we are just focusing on drawing those connections. So sources might connect or intersect in lots of different ways. They might agree with one another, support one another, disagree with one another, or agree or disagree, but only partially. And most of the time, this isn't stated directly. So you'll have to sort of notice those things and make note while you're annotating, right? You might say, oh, well, source A seems to support source B, or source A directly contradicts what source B is saying. And those are the things that you'll need to look for and take note of while you're annotating. So we've got an example here, and this is from our textbook. It's on page 524 of Norton's field guide, if you want to look more closely at it. But this is sort of what annotating for synthesis might look like. You're going to see several different sources here, and the writer or the reader, well, they're kind of doing both, right, has highlighted places in which these things intersect. So none of these sources directly mention one another, right? You have to come up with those connections in your notes. But this person who was annotating has noticed, okay, so this talks about gun ownership and limiting gun ownership right here. Source 4 talks about it in this place, and source 3 talks about it in this place. So you want to annotate, but you want to do that with purpose. As you read, it's also important to take notes and summarize each source briefly. But again, you're summarizing with purpose here. Keep the author or the speaker's main ideas in mind, but pay close attention to how and where those ideas overlap with the other sources that you're synthesizing. So as you summarize, rather than the purpose of simply giving a broad overall picture of what the author says, Now you're looking for not only that broad overall picture, but also places in which this author or speaker sort of speaks to or talks about the same things that the other authors or speakers discuss. So, an example, let's assume that I'm summarizing 3 sources about gun ownership. In my summaries, I need to note the author's overall points as they relate to my purpose, which is how I'm going to draw those connections, right? So I'll say that source 1 claims that the Constitution clearly says we can bear arms, but there should be limits to that right. So this is what the author says, but it also is discussing that limit on gun ownership, right? So my summary is still purposeful. And then source 2 claims that a Supreme Court justice noted how even at the time the Constitution afforded these rights to citizens, some weapons were excluded. So it's reasonable to also exclude some weapons today. And then source 3 claims that research shows many Americans agree with this concept that we can own guns, but maybe there should be reasonable limits to that ownership, right? So as I'm summarizing, and these are very brief, this wouldn't be my entire summary, but if I'm making notes to myself about these sources that we see on page 524, that's sort of what it might look like, right? I'm not leaving out the big picture idea of what the author said, but I am more focused on what he or she says specifically about these limits on gun ownership, because that, might be my topic at this time. So after you have summarized and then identified some places where the author's or speaker's main ideas intersect, then it's time to decide what to include. So you want to make sure that you're including important connections about big ideas the authors share or disagree about. But you can leave out minor details which won't help your synthesis overall. So as you're annotating and summarizing, you'll probably have lots of information about important ways that these things connect and overlap, and also some ways that maybe are more minor. So you'll have to make some, decisions here about what you want to include in your synthesis. So definitely stick with those big ideas and the important ways in which these things overlap, and then leave out those minor details. So now that you've done all of this work, now it's time to get to actually writing the synthesis. So you should take the overlapping ideas from each source, which you identified through that purposeful annotating and that purposeful summarizing, and work those into a synthesis of your sources. Remember that synthesis assignments are going to vary in length. So pay attention to the assignment to determine how long your synthesis needs to be. You might need, just a couple paragraphs or a paragraph, or for an essay, maybe you need an entire essay on synthesis. And that's going to determine sort of how much and what kinds of information get to be included. Because if you only have a paragraph of synthesis, you're going to include much less information than if you have an entire essay, right? So pay attention to those length requirements for various assignments. Sorry if you can hear my chickens in the background. They're going kind of crazy this morning when I'm recording. Synthesis assignments might also include a brief summary of each source. So again, keep track of those purposeful summaries and, be prepared to fix them up and use them if necessary. And then they might also require textual evidence. So if you are finding places that these sources, overlap and you're discussing those, you might need to include some quotes that demonstrate that, depending on the type of assignment that you're working with. So make sure that you're also keeping track of those quotes or paraphrases which you've identified through that purposeful annotating. So a quick recap of how to synthesize and what it is. So number 1, remember the overall goal is drawing connections between sources, usually for a specific purpose. You want to start by annotating each source, and then summarizing each source. And remember, these are purposeful, so you're usually annotating to look for a specific way to use those sources, right? And the same with summarizing when you're working towards a synthesis. Draw connections between the sources. Once you have your annotations and your summaries, then you can look for those connections. And finally, write your synthesis, paying attention to what the specific assignment requirements are. If you have any questions about this, we have lots of information in the textbook that can help you with, how to annotate, how to summarize, how to synthesize, as well as tutoring on campus. And of course, you can always ask me for additional help as well. So don't be afraid to reach out for that extra help if you need it.